It's 12:30 here on the East Coast. The sun is up. When we began this morning, it was dark. Thank you all for staying with our exciting conference and presentations that will continue on for 2 more presentations and a roundtable with Alfred Ceramic Art faculty. Our moderator for the next session will be my colleague, art history associate professor and division head here at Alfred University, Dr. Hope Childers. Over to you, Hope.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Megan, and everybody else for making this such a great event. I'm so pleased to be a part of it. I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions while you're listening to the presentations, please type them up in the Q&A section. You can see that at the bottom of the screen, and you can also use the chat. So we'll be taking questions after each paper and then have a discussion section afterwards. So our first speaker is Meghen Pitelka, who is chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And his paper is entitled The Social Life of Raku Teabowls.
Great, thank you so much. I want to really quickly explain a little bit about my background because that informs my approach to studying the history of Raku ceramics. My father is a professional potter. Some of you may know him, Vince Pitelka. My mother is a professional historian, Linda Pitelka, and I guess am carrying on the traditions of my family by studying the history of ceramics. I learned to make pottery as a kid. I grew up in a workshop around the kiln and have continued doing so up to the present day. But I also bring the critical and in some ways sort of scientific intentionality of the historian to my study of this tradition. And those are both really important parts of how I approach studying Raku ceramics based in the evidence, but also with a real love for the works themselves. Could I get the next slide, please? So Raku ceramics are most famous, perhaps, for the work of the individual who's thought to be the founder of the tradition, whose name is Chojiro, who lived in the late 16th century in Kyoto and is usually associated with the wabi style of tea ceramics. Next slide, please. He is believed to have worked for the famous, highly mythologized, but also highly influential tea master who we've heard a lot about already, Sen no Rikyu. And part of what was challenging about studying the history of the Raku tradition is that there's a lot of writing about Raku and Chojiro that happens a century or more later that is anachronistic. It's not based in scientifically verifiable evidence. It's speculative, imaginative, or even a form of marketing. I worked hard on the archaeological and documentary evidence from the late 16th century to try to tease out what we can really say about the origins of Raku ceramics. And what I found and what many scholars in Japan have found might surprise you. Next slide, please. We know that Chojiro not only made tea bowls, but also made this remarkable roof tile figure, a mythical Chinese lion or a shishi, that shows really a great deal of skill and is made of the same kind of clay and has some of the same kind of glaze as some Raku ceramics. And additionally is signed as having been made by Chojiro in 1574. How do we square his Teabowl production with a ceramic roof tile? Next slide, please. Well, it turns out that in the late 16th century, there was in Kyoto a population of Chinese migrant potters, among many other groups of artisans, laborers, and merchants. They lived around Sanjo Avenue, and they worked in different industries in the city, which was, of course, the imperial capital, and also for some decades during the late 16th century, the political capital of Japan. And Chojiro has long been associated with that community, but excavations of some consumer sites in Kyoto have revealed that he was not the only potter making low temperature lead glazed ceramics, in other words, Raku style ceramics, because pieces like the ones that you see on the screen have been excavated, which are clearly not made in Chojido style. The bowl on the left, for example, is wheel thrown and glazed on the interior with the typical matte black glaze that we associate with Raku ceramics, which is made at least in part from grinding up river stones from a nearby river. But on the outside is decorated with brushwork and a translucent glaze covering the exterior in a fashion that is never seen in Raku ceramics, with maybe one or two exceptions. The plate on the right, as you can see, is probably made by draping a slab over a mold and is decorated more in the style that we would come to associate with Oribe ceramics than with Raku ceramics, but it too is a low-fire lead glazed serving dish. And these are both from late 16th century consumer sites in the city. And this has led us, next slide please, to speculate that Chojido was in fact part of this community of Chinese migrant potters. Probably they came to Japan from the Fujian region of China. They worked in a low-fire lead glazed three-color tradition in China, exemplified by the plate you can see on the right-hand side. And that led to them bringing those techniques to Japan and to their work as roof tile makers. And in the case of Chojido and perhaps other potters, to their work operating very small scale kilns in Kyoto that allowed them to collaborate directly with tea practitioners who lived in Kyoto and Sakai and who were innovating in all kinds of interesting ways, as we've heard throughout this conference, in designing new styles of wares for the tea ceremony. Next slide, please. So what's so interesting about this history, which again is pretty well verifiable in the archaeological evidence and corresponds to a range of documentary sources as well, is that the earliest Raku tea bowls, which are not named Raku and are not attributed by name to Chojido, but are called black tea bowls or now tea bowls, imayaki tea bowls, were probably part of a wave of experimental ceramic production that occurred in the city of Kyoto, and that then was sort of farmed out to larger kilns in Mino, where traditions like the Black Seto tradition, the Shino tradition, the Oribe tradition developed and evolved. So I think we can think of the potters in Kyoto, with Chojido being one of those potters, as close collaborators of these visionary tea masters, with Sen no Rikyu being one of those rather than the sole one who matters. And so we see that the birth of Raku ceramics is not the product of one genius potter and one genius tea master, but a community, a diverse community of artisans, potters, tea masters, collaborating together and negotiating in the creation of new styles of ceramics. This, to me, is a much more exciting, but also a much more likely explanation for the birth of a ware that would come to be as influential as Raku ceramics. So I want to look now at some of the characteristics of Raku tea bowls to try to understand what makes them special. Next slide, please. So the first quality is the fact that Raku tea bowls are handmade. Now you may think, come on, we're talking about a pre-industrial society here. All ceramics are handmade. But what I mean by handmade is not just made by the hand of an artist. I mean hand carved without the intervention of any kind of mechanized tool. Next slide, please. So Raku tea bowls are not made on a potter's wheel. Instead, they're formed into a cylinder and then very carefully allowed to dry and harden enough that they can be carved using a metal or wooden spoon or knife or other tool. And so the term in Japanese, tezukune, that is often used to describe the production process, is closer to hand carving. And what this means is that the entire time the potter is forming a tea bowl over the course of days or weeks, the potter is holding that piece in the hands. And the feel and the weight of it, although obviously this changes after the firing completely removes all the moisture and partially vitrifies the clay, still the feeling and shape of the tea bowl is always in the hand of the potter. And that's simply not the case for tea bowls that are thrown on either a hand wheel or a kick wheel. And I think this means that these tea bowls had a unique tactile quality for the tea masters who worked with Chojiro and the other early low-fire lead-glazed potters in Kyoto that led to some of the innovations we see in tea bowls in the late 16th and early 17th century. Next slide, please. Furthermore, Raku tea bowls are fired to a relatively low temperature, around 1000 degrees centigrade, in a very small charcoal kiln. These kilns are so small that they are usually indoors. They can exist in the city of Kyoto, whereas large multi-chamber kilns that produced a lot of pollution could not exist in the city of Kyoto. They moved farther and farther out to the outskirts, and eventually they had to be located even farther outside of the main urban agglomeration. The tea bowl is removed from the charcoal when it reaches the right temperature using iron tongs, and those tongs sometimes, but not always, leave a mark on the final tea bowl. Next slide, please. Here we see Raku Kichizaemon the 15th holding a still glowing tea bowl that he has just removed from the kiln. The two main styles of Raku tea bowls are black tea bowls and red tea bowls, and these are actually fired in different kilns. The red bowls are fired to a slightly higher temperature. They have a translucent glaze over a red slip that needs to reach a higher temperature, whereas the black tea bowls are fired to around 1000 degrees, as I said before, and are less vitrified. They thud when you tap them. But the result, next slide please, is a tea bowl that truly feels comfortable in the hand. Now, some Raku tea bowls are quite small. And here you see a Chojiro tea bowl in the hand of Kichizaemon. I mean, he's a tall, lanky man, so he has big hands. But you still can see how small this tea bowl is. Some Raku tea bowls, especially of the second and third generations, are significantly larger and even thinner than the work that we see here. So the shape and the size varies a lot depending on the generation and the period. But the basic quality of being supremely tactile and feeling like this work was born to hold in my hands is, I think, the most important characteristic of a Raku tea bowl. One other point that I'm sure is already obvious, especially to those of you who are potters, is that the fact that these bowls are fired to a relatively low temperature means that they don't conduct heat as easily. This is something Bob Mowry mentioned yesterday. And holding a Raku tea bowl filled with hot matcha, with hot powdered green tea, is a warm, comfortable sensation rather than a burning sensation. Some tea bowls you hold with your fingers on the foot and your thumb on the rim so that you don't get burned. You don't have to do that with a Raku tea bowl because the heat is not conducted as effectively, it's less vitrified. And I think that's another one of these fundamental material characteristics of this tradition that makes these bowls perfect for use in a tea gathering. Next slide, please. So the second characteristic I want to call your attention to is the involvement of amateur potters in the tradition in a much more direct way than is found in any other ceramic tradition that I know of in East Asia. Next slide, please. The most famous example of this is the ceramics of the jack of all trades artist Honnami Koetsu, who is perhaps most famous as a calligrapher, although he also was a professional sword polisher. He collaborated in the production of lacquer works, paintings, so many different amazing forms of cultural production in the 17th century. He also was a tea practitioner and a lover of ceramics, and he wrote letters to the Raku workshop requesting clay, then saying the tea bowls are ready to be picked up, and then the tea bowls would go back to the kiln and they would fire them. And the kind of unusual and, by the standards of the time, bizarre shapes and decorative approaches of Koetsu's work could only be the product of an amateur. A professional potter would have the skills, but also follow the rules of the genre such that these innovations, I think, would not be possible. But through the collaboration between an amateur potter who's really a tea practitioner and a professional potter like the Raku potters, these amazing works could be born. Next slide, please. These works became so valorized in the tradition that you have a really major stream of Raku ceramics in later centuries, in which professional potters like the Raku potter Raku Ryonyu reproduce or copy the works of amateur potters like Honnami Koetsu. And this Teabowl, Kaga Koetsu, is one of Koetsu's most famous works and is also one of the most widely copied Teabowl shapes and designs in all of Japanese ceramic history. I have 3 or 4 copies of this Teabowl just made by, as far as I know, anonymous potters from various periods in Japanese ceramic history. This is a form that was honored by reproducing it. These are not attempts to create forgeries, but rather to celebrate the originality of the work. Next slide, please. We also find tea masters from the tea schools, from the Iemoto system, requesting clay from the Raku kiln and making tea bowls with often startling results, like this famous tea bowl by the head of the Omotesenke school in the early 18th century, Kakukakusai, named after a comedic character in a play. I'm sure that when this tea bowl was first pulled out of the kiln and a chunk of the wall broke off, probably because the water hadn't fully evaporated, it was going to be tossed until someone said, you know, it actually has an interesting front. Talk about keshki, right? I mean, here we have a really remarkable looking tea bowl. Next slide, please. So that leads me to another characteristic of Raku ceramics that is absolutely core to understanding its vibrancy, but also its survival for now 16 generations. And that's the patronage of the tea schools. Next slide, please. The tea schools around the 100th anniversary of Rikyu's death, which Andrew Maskey mentioned in his talk earlier today, had a kind of Rikyu revival where everything associated with Rikyu was celebrated. This was born of actual religious practices in the Sen family, where the 100-year death anniversary was something very important to them in terms of their worldview and their belief system. But for the tea schools as corporate bodies, the celebration of Rikyu was, in a sense, a kind of marketing event in which the authenticity and legitimacy that their business was built on, namely their family connection to Rikyu, could be separated. And around the time of the Rikyu revival and thereafter, the Sen tea schools regularly commissioned very large orders of Raku tea bowls from the Raku family and celebrated the supposed relationship between Chojiro and Rikyu. I don't mean to say Rikyu and Chojiro didn't work with each other, but it was amplified through the celebration of the family connection after the Rikyu revival. So on the left, we see a black Raku tea bowl by Raku Sanyu, the 5th generation of the official Raku lineage, that was part of a series of 200 tea bowls that he made for the, I believe, Omotesenke family. On the right, we see another example of that same series. Next slide, please. We also find that the amateur tea bowls that are made by the heads of the tea schools, like this interesting bowl called Hatsuzakura by Kakukakusai, were given away to disciples within the tea school. And I've argued that this is a form of education, in a sense, where the heads of the tea schools can prescribe the aesthetic preferences of their followers through giving utensils as gifts. So here, Kakukakusai has made this kind of Koetsu style, somewhat lumpy tea bowl and given it to his followers. And this prescribes the love of Raku ceramics as a rule for the followers of the Sen tea tradition. Next slide, please. So all of these successful activities to promote Rikyu and promote his connection to Chojiro and to prescribe the love of Raku ceramics within the tea schools coincided also with the growth in the number of followers in the tea schools, and this increased demand for Raku ceramics. But the Raku kiln never expanded its operation to become a kind of pseudo mass production studio, as happened in many other ceramic traditions in China and in Japan. Instead, they defined themselves as a kind of one master per generation outfit. In fact, there were assistants and there were family members who took part in the activities of the kiln. But the kind of public-facing business model was one master who always took the name Kichizaemon and then retired to take a Buddhist name, and so on and so forth. So the production did not expand to meet the demand, at least not enough. And as a result, next slide, please, there is a book that is published illicitly in 1736 by a block print publisher in Osaka called Collected Raku Ceramic Secrets. It's a long book in 2 volumes that gives all kinds of details about how to make raku ceramics. You couldn't probably use this if you knew nothing about ceramic production to start your own raku kiln. But if you had some ceramic knowledge, if you already were trained in a pottery tradition, you could use this to make raku ceramics in your own style and to your own aesthetic tastes, as many, many tea practitioners and potters did all across Japan after the publication of this book. Next slide, please. So the raku tradition expands across the entire Japanese archipelago, and there are dozens and dozens of raku-style kilns, as well as many amateur potters who make raku ceramics, raku teabows for their own use and to give away as gifts. One example is the merchant Kawamura Kyokuzen, who had his own small raku kiln and made a range of raku teabows that are really, I think, quite interesting and gesture towards the orthodox raku lineage, but also are very innovative and can experiment because they're not made for tea school customers. They're made for the pleasure of the maker. So it's another sign of that amateur involvement being really core to the evolution of raku ceramics over time. Next slide, please. Raku ceramics were even in demand by the leading family of the early modern period, the Tokugawa family. And the Tokugawa leaders and the branch family heads would sometimes hire raku potters to come to their rural estates and perform these ceramic workshops. And what I believe happened is that the raku potter would basically assemble a teabowl over a series of days, sort of performatively, and then the warrior lord would come and carve a few pieces out of the side, and then it would be attributed to that warrior leader, and he could give it away to his family or vassals as a gift, as we see in this example by Tokugawa Naritaka, the leader of the Owari Tokugawa family. So raku became a truly national tradition, even though it still, in theory, was dominated by one small family in Kyoto. Next slide, please. I'm almost out of time, but I want to at least mention that raku underwent perhaps its most massive transformation in the modern era when it was redefined to suit the needs of modern intellectuals and politicians and collectors and the new discipline of art history, the leaders of that field, who needed raku to be a story of individual artists instead of a family tradition, and beyond that, a national tradition. Next slide, please. And in works like the book published, or the series of books published in the 1920s, the Taisho Meikikan, or the model masterpieces of Taisho, the raku potters are discussed not in terms of this family tradition sprawling over many generations or their close collaboration with amateurs and tea masters, but instead as a series of individualistic artistic geniuses, each of whom supposedly had a completely separate aesthetic. And the tradition of reproducing the works of prior generations is essentially erased. During the war, raku is subsumed into highly nationalistic narratives about Japanese culture, and the connections to China are also largely elided. And in the post-war era, raku gets locked, I feel, in a kind of high modernist discourse about individuality that's completely at odds with the actual way that raku ceramics continued to be made, which is in close collaboration with tea practitioners who use them and love them and name them. And that's a relationship I always try to emphasize in my work on this wonderful tradition. So I'm out of time. I look forward to your comments and questions. And thanks to all the presenters before me for really amazing presentations. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Morgan, for that excellent talk. Really interesting to see a kind of, I don't know, I'm also a trained potter. And so this is news to me, right? Looking back at my textbooks from my ceramics degree, thinking about the way that Raku pottery was framed. This has been really eye-opening, and I appreciate that. So there are a couple of questions so far. I'd like to remind everybody to please add your questions to the Q&A or the chat. We can find them on the chat. And so maybe we'll start with this first question from Sung-Yun Sang. Can you tell us a little bit more about the readership of the collected secrets of Raku ceramics?
Yeah, thanks, Sung. That's a great question. We don't know, in a sense, because block printed books were widely available in Tokugawa, Japan after the late 17th century, and especially in the 18th and 19th centuries when this book was in circulation. Block printed books were sold in bookstores in the cities. So you could buy this book probably in Osaka and Edo. I don't know if you could have gotten away with selling it in Kyoto. I have to wonder if an angry Raku potter wouldn't have marched into the bookstore and demanded that it be taken down off the shelves. But there even were wandering booksellers and book lenders who would travel the highways of Tokugawa period Japan and sell books or lend books to merchants, artisans, or even wealthy farmers in towns and rural communities. So the early modern Japanese population was pretty literate, and the urban population was really remarkably literate. So anyone with an interest in tea or ceramics, in theory, could have gotten access to this book. In addition to the book, I also discovered dozens of handwritten manuscripts in provincial libraries all over Japan that no one had ever called attention to before in the study of the Raku ceramic tradition, in which the Raku lineage and the Raku seal that is sometimes used to mark the bottom of Teabowls and the general stylistic differences and even some of the technical secrets are written down in really sloppy handwriting. And I suspect that this is the result of individual tea practitioners who wanted to know more about Raku, or potters who wanted to master the Raku technique, borrowing the book, Collected Secrets of Raku Ceramics, or other books that are no longer extant about Raku, and copying them themselves so that they would then have a version they could keep when they had to return the book to the traveling lending library. So basically, the readership was probably tea practitioners and potters who served tea practitioners. I see this other question, Hope. Shall I go to that?
Sure.
So Anna asked, who was the author of this secret book? And the answer is we don't know. The name that is given is clearly a pen name. It's not identifiable as a person who is known in any historical record, and it's not a pen name associated with any other book. So the answer is someone who knew enough about the processes of the production of Raku ceramics to be able to write the book, but not someone who's known to us. There were rival Raku kilns or Raku style kilns in the late 17th century. And it's possible that a potter from one of those rival traditions could have written the book, but there's no evidence of that.
Probably the next question flows right from that. Andrew Maskey asked, sometimes Raku potters made tea bowls that resembled throne bowls that were not in the Raku tradition. In other words, bowls of other traditions besides Raku. Do you have any idea what would have motivated them to make such bowls?
So thank you, wonderful question. I don't really know, but to speculate, I think that as tea culture expanded beyond the community of elites in Kyoto and Sakai who originally dominated it, it became very playful, and it became a site for experimentation and the creation of identities for the urban townspeople, so the artisans and merchants who lived in cities and large towns, and for the warrior, the well-educated warrior elites who studied tea and collected Raku ceramics. And I think that for later generations of Raku potters in the 18th century especially, there's just a playfulness that to me is very revealing. And one of the reasons I think our focus always on Chojido as the founder is unfortunate is I think it really masks the creativity of later generations of Raku potters. And the idea of the Iemoto system as a kind of ossified structure that squelches creativity and squelches innovation, which is a critique that modern artists, especially the Mingei artists, offered of this system that they wanted to rebel against, I think is a real misrepresentation of the space within the Iemoto system that potters have to do things that are different through their collaborations, through their social relationships with tea practitioners. Many Raku potters were themselves very active tea practitioners, and they loved to engage in toriawase, the practice that Oyobe Sensei so eloquently described in her presentation. That is a playful, creative act that Raku potters could participate in, even as their works were also being used in those selections and arrangements.
Maybe that ties into a question by Lewis Johnson. He's a visiting faculty member in the art history division this semester. He says, yesterday, I believe you used the notion of a community of practitioners. Today, it seems you're emphasizing more the input of amateurs and the specific relation between potters and tea practitioners. I wondered whether you would like to clarify the notion of community that you were using yesterday in relation to this history.
So thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'm sometimes sloppy in my use of these terms, and I apologize for that. By community of practitioners, I don't mean a community of potters. I mean the community of tea practitioners. And I think the Raku family, but also the amateur Raku potters, were very much active members of the broad community of tea practitioners. In fact, there were many, overlapping communities of tea practitioners that were distinct because of the school or because of the locale. But in the origins of the Raku ceramic technique in late 16th century Kyoto, I don't see the work of one in the work of many artisans and many tea practitioners. In the evolution of the practice in the 17th century, I don't see one family passing the tradition from father to son. I see a vibrant workshop that was working regularly with amateur potters and tea masters in the creation of all kinds of unusual wares beyond just the kind of lineal production and reproduction of the Chojido style. And in the 18th century, with the expansion of the technique across the archipelago through the publication of the collected secrets of Raku ceramics, through the handwritten manuscripts, and through the often really kind of diverse Raku style kilns that pop up around Japan, I see the engagement with the Raku tradition of the entire community of tea practitioners. So to me, the tendency to reduce the story to the story of the head of the Raku family generation after generation is less interesting than this much bigger story of dissemination and evolution through contestation and collaboration, which is a story that I'm interested in.
Well, thank you for that. And maybe now we'll move on to our next speaker. And there are lots of questions in the Q&A and chat. We haven't forgotten about them, and we will round them up together in the discussion section at the end of the panel. And so now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, my esteemed colleague and organizer of this fabulous event, Dr. Meghen Jones. She is the curator of Path of the Teabowl, and she's also an associate professor of art history here at Alfred. And her talk focuses on Alfred in part, called The Teabowl at Alfred. It's over to you, Meghen.
Thank you so much, Hope. And I'm looking forward to our discussion at the end to get into more of these important questions that were posed just now in the chat and in the Q&A. Tea bowls are part of the discourse of modern and contemporary American ceramics. You're looking at a collection of bowls referred to as tea bowls on the shelves of the home of Alfred Ceramic Art faculty, John and Andrea Gill. Religious ritual, cultural identities, and artistic identities make the Teabowl a transnational iconic form of ceramics today. There are differing definitions of Teabowl, from the orthodox to the iconoclastic. And this iconic continuum is why some contemporary artists have used the Teabowl idiom to take conceptual flights of creativity. Next. Oh, sorry, stay on this one. Over the last 10% or so of Teabowl history, the last century, potters and artists have pursued the Teabowl idiom for both its utility and its art. Today, I'd like to look into the local context of bringing an exhibition of Teabowls to Alfred University's New York State College of Ceramics, formerly the New York State School of Clay Working and Ceramics, founded in 1900. We'll see a variety of ways artists at Alfred looked to the Teabowl for both stylistic and conceptual inspiration. I'll show some works in the exhibition in relation to this discourse at Alfred, and we'll be looking at examples by Charles Fergus Binns, Daniel Rhodes, Robert Turner, Peter Volkus, and Ken Price. And then later, before we conclude our conference, you'll be hearing from several current ceramic art faculty in the roundtable. Slide, please. Could we make it so that this didn't cut off? Is there any way to do that? Thank you. For the exhibition path of the Teabowl, we borrowed a number of representative Chinese Teabowls, or bowls, as we know we should say. These bowls that did become chapter 1 in Teabowl history, such as this Suzhou type bowl, prized for its comparatively experimental qualities, as this type of ware was not made, we think, for the imperial court. Early bowls in China set the stage for the first perceived iconicity of the Teabowl, with tea itself associated with Taoist immortality, and then within Chan or Zen temples, where monastic codes dictated how tea was to be consumed. Confucianism also is thought to have imparted self-deprecating language and bowing, modes of behavior and comportment that are associated with many tea rituals that endure today. Slide, please. We position the 1,000-year-old Chinese works in relation to contemporary works that closely reference them. Furutani Noriyuki, for example, describes the techniques involved with the iridescent black glaze he achieves as infinite and requiring exacting attention to form. And here's an example of a contemporary tea bowl stand, lacquer on wood from Japan. Slide. So then how do we situate a bowl like this into this broader history, this history that we might term a transnational history of an iconic ceramic form? The founding director of the New York State College of Ceramics, Charles Fergus Binns, was known as the father of American studio ceramics. He's known for initiating what was called the Alfred pot, a utilitarian stoneware vessel strongly influenced by East Asian ceramics. If you want to learn more about Binns at Alfred, read Margaret Carney's catalog raisonné that she published on the occasion of an exhibition of Binns's ceramics at Alfred. Born in England, Binns spent 25 years working at the Royal Worcester Pottery, where his father was director before coming to the US. And like his contemporaries in France, such as Ernest Chaplet, Binns looked for artistic inspiration in Chinese ceramics, especially for their glazes. Next. Binns enlarged the conical genware form and achieved, indeed through his glaze formulations, the effect of hare's fur. To him, the glaze formed the decoration. There was no need for further embellishment. In this case, we can read it as quite modernist. Did Binns intend for these bowls to be made for tea? My running assumption is that they were made as general purpose, artful bowls, not tea bowls, but inspired by tea bowls and bowls in general. made in East Asia. Slide. In his 1898 book, The Story of the Potter, he wrote of the Song dynasty, claiming, quote, "The Chinese potters began to play tricks with their materials, and as their skill increased, they gave full play to their fanciful imaginations. The most remarkable series of successes are found in what are now known as single colors." Binns famously pursued both the technology and art of ceramics. In 1925, he had been awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree by colleagues at Alfred, and he gave a series of lectures on the material and technical properties of ceramics at the Metropolitan Museum. Slide. If Binns influenced students at Alfred to look to Chinese ceramics for inspiration in form and glaze, it was Daniel Rhodes, who was born in 1911 and passed away in 1989, who influenced students to look to Japan. Alfred's first MFA recipient, Rhodes taught in the Alfred Art Department from 1947 to 1973. In this span of time, he influenced many students. This bowl, donated by Anne Shaner, the wife of ceramist David Shaner, echoes the straight-sided bowls with large interior volumes that began to be made in the late Momoyama and early Edo periods. The rim is uneven, an effect amplified by the thinning of the glaze on it. The glaze is pockmarked with iron flecks, and a nudge is recorded in the lower right, as we see here. It speaks in these ways to the centuries-old Japanese aesthetics of rousing empathy toward the imperfect. Slide. We might look to this Teabowl by Rhodes's contemporary over in Japan for some formal resonances. We might ask the question, could this be perceived as a kind of source, as a kind of original? Bestowed by the Japanese government the title Living National Treasure in 1983, Miwa Kyusetsu was the 11th generation head potter of his family. Hagiware dates to the wartime Keicho era, when Korean potters were forcibly brought to Japan. They and their descendants produced favored tea utensils for wabi-style tea. Typical for Hagiware is its semi-opaque, thick white glaze that crackles often to dramatic effect. Miwa dubbed his oni, or devil, hagi. We can place a Teabowl like this in the contextual continuum of ritualistic tea drinking in Japan. This way of encouraging the drinking of tea to be seen as a practice aiding in mindfulness, aiding in attention to the here and now. And the cracks here might echo for some users that sense of mindfulness. But how might we compare Rhodes's Teabowl to this then? There are many layers to unpeel in this history. Like this bowl, there are cracks and fissures in this history. Slide. Rhodes managed the pottery at the Heart Mountain World War II Japanese-American confinement site, where he met Minnie Neguro, who was confined there. After the war, Neguro studied at Alfred, and she went on to work as a studio pottery and teach at RISD and the University of Connecticut. Rhodes later conducted Fulbright-sponsored research in Japan in 1962-63, resulting in a book on Tamba pottery. His writing on Tamba pottery reflected a Western modernist sensibility, in which art of the past is seen as relevant to the present due to its perceived timelessness. He also argued that Tamba pots should be seen as works of art. Echoing Mingei precepts, he wrote that the manipulation of clay tells of the spirit of the maker, and that the pots he saw at Tamba were very much like their makers. Quote, humble potters not striving for self-expression, end quote. Slide. In his book, Pottery Form, published in 1976, Rhodes wrote that Japanese Teabowls are, quote, symbols of nature, time, beauty, feeling, friendship, and hospitality that have an inner mystical spirit. Like Rhodes's bowl that I just showed you, the one pictured here is thrown and distorted. It's presumably by Rhodes himself, though the caption here doesn't confirm that. Slide. One of Rhodes's students in the late 1940s was Robert Turner. According to Rhodes, Turner made, quote, at least 100 variations on a small tea bowl, searching for the form which would be just right. The right form had the most subtle turn imaginable from base to lip. Rhodes went on to praise how Turner, quote, put values into the work, which made it unique, personal, and yet at the same time classical, in that it seems to extend the best pottery traditions of the past, end quote. Binns had disarticulated the tea bowl idiom from its culturally iconic precedents. Rhodes and Turner furthered that dislocation. The teacher and student moved the tea bowl into a more abstract template for form and for individual expression. Slide. In 2002, the New York Times described Peter Voulkos as having, quote, elevated ceramics to new levels of abstraction and personal expression, end quote. This Voulkos tea bowl from the Art Complex Museum, Duxbury, in our exhibition is large, heavy, and cracked through its base. The disarticulation from use is quite vivid. It's far removed from earlier tea bowls he made in the 1950s that followed the rules of symmetrical form and even surfaces he had learned as a student at Montana State. Slide. Like Franz Klein, Voulkos was greatly influenced by Japanese art, but that influence has historically not been fully accounted for in scholarship and criticism. The critic Clement Greenberg, for example, saw Klein's painting as purely American. But as Eugenia Bogdanova-Kumar recently has written, Klein's painting resonated with the avant-garde Japanese calligraphy group, Bokujinkai, who communicated with Klein and other American artists in the 1950s. Klein himself apparently denied any Japanese influence. Voulkos, in contrast, publicly said he had a vision that in a previous life, he was a Kyoto potter living in the Kamakura period. Voulkos embraced his Japanophilia. Slide. In 1954, Voulkos observed Japanese potter Hamada Shoji throwing. And as the story goes, it was a revelation. Voulkos was excited by the distortion he witnessed, the breaking of the rules. Next. But Voulkos's engagement with Japan began earlier, at age 19, when he was drafted to serve the US Army Air Corps in World War II. He served for 3 years as an airplane armor gunner in the Central Pacific, stationed in Saipan and bombing Japan, as this Mitchell B-25 bomber is taking off to do in the photo at the left. Voulkos's later work, fired in a Japanese-style noborigama, echoed the effects of Momoyama period Japanese wares that embraced the beauty and truth of imperfection and scarring. Could his use of noborigama relate at all to the trauma of war that he experienced? Slide. And how does this relate to Alfred? This is a tea bowl that Voulkos gifted to Alfred Ceramic Art professors at the time of his 1998 visit here. He came to receive an honorary doctorate, and ceramic art professor John Gill acquired this for his collection. Thank you, Andrea and John, for providing this photo. Voulkos came to receive an honorary doctorate and the Charles Fergus Binns Medal for Excellence in Ceramics. What would Binns have thought of this Teabowl? Slide, please. Ken Price received his MFA from Alfred in 1959, and in 1962 toured Japan over 6 months, where he felt inspiration, he said, from Japanese tea ceremony vessels' scale relative to their significance. He also wrote that Vulcus was, quote, the single strongest influence, unquote, on him. That Vulcus was, quote, the major force in liberating the material, unquote. And he also said a black Raku Teabowl was very influential to him. That Teabowl's previous owner had left it behind when he was forced to enter a World War II Japanese-American concentration camp. Price recounted that holding that Japanese Raku bowl ran a chill down his back and made his neck hairs stand up. North American tea bowls have not simply been appropriations of East Asian styles. The appropriation process involved, and continues to involve, a more complex set of transnational, iconic, and symbolic processes. On one hand, knowing of the value of iconic tea bowls in East Asia, and also informed by the experiences of artists during World War II and its aftermath. This presentation has been a slice of that deeply layered subject. Thank you.
Gosh, I'm in the dark here. I'm in a very gloomy place. Thank you so much, Meghen, for that interesting talk and so locally relevant. Please, I just want to remind everybody, if you have further questions, please put them in the Q&A, which you can access at the bottom of your Zoom window. Actually, maybe I could start off with a question. I'm so interested in the, Morgan mentioned the high modernism of the Raku influences towards the end, right? And here we're seeing a similar impact in, for instance, the dialogue with Franz Klein and Vulcus with Asian sources. I'm wondering if you have an idea of the role of the institution in all this. This is such a different trajectory in a way for ceramics that happens in the United States that is not quite, but is sort of similar to the apprenticeship model that characterized ceramics for so long. What role does the institution play in shaping this history that you describe?
That's a great question. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the Alfred Ceramic Art faculty who will be participating in a roundtable next, after we go into discussion with the three of us. The institution at Alfred, as you know, begins with Charles Fergus Binns, who embraced a twin route for ceramic pedagogy at this university. On the one hand, focused on engineering, and on the other hand, focused on art. And I think that set up the succeeding decades of ceramic art pedagogy here to provide students access to the pursuit of a variety of complex technical goals. Today, when you're walking around the studios and you enter the huge kiln room, you get the sense that the sky's the limit. Anything is technically possible here. And I think Binns set that up. And so with that set of tools, as it were, in one's back pocket, I think that allowed students at Alfred University to, look at photos and books of tea bowls from around the world and translate those to artistic visions that they had. So I think, as I said, that technical foundation was really important. And the move towards maybe a heavier weight on the artistic side of ceramic art education occurred after World War II, and that coincided with a steep decline of the American ceramic industry. And Japan is implicated in that history very closely because many imports of dinnerware and such were coming into the US from the 1930s or so onward. And again, the ceramic art faculty colleagues who will be here in a bit, I'm sure can speak later to that. I see there's a couple other questions.
There's some questions that are specific to the exhibition that I would like to ask. One is from Lewis Johnson, and he says, I'd be interested to hear more about the memorable platinum teabowl from the exhibit.
Oh,
It still seems challenging to me to think it can be drunk from, but perhaps more interesting for me as a non-specialist would be able to hear more about the tactile experience of it and how this relates to the significance of the tea ceremony overall.
yeah, and I think he posed that question earlier in response to Dr. Oyobe's talk. We were lucky to borrow that teabowl from the University of Michigan. And that relates to what's going on at Alfred. Maybe this is an important part of the 2021 scope of this focus on Alfred as a case study for the teabowl in North America, because many of my students have expressed extreme delight in Kuwata's work. How does this relate to the tea ceremony overall and its tactility? It amplifies that. I think what Kuwata is doing in several important ways is upping the ante on tea bowls and their expression and how they relate to the body and how they relate to ceramics history, and on and on and on. So,
another sort of Volkus question, why did Volkus create Teabowls after having gone through an abstract sculptural mode? What did Teabowls as a ceramic idiom mean to Volkus? This is a question from Yasuko Tsuchikane.
Dr. Tsuchikane, thank you for this important question about Volkus. He started making Teabowls in the 1950s before he launched into this remarkable period of abstract and in many cases large-scale ceramic sculptural production. And sorry, I just want to look at her question again as I respond. So he was thinking about Teabowls from the 1950s onward, and then it's by the 1990s that we start to see these highly conceptual references to the idea of a Teabowl, but according to those very abstract sculptural artistic explorations that he had been making by that point for several decades. In terms of what did Teabowls as a ceramic idiom mean to Volkus, there are some historical documents indicating that he praised Teabowls. He saw them as important embodiments of ceramics from Japan and all of the expressive ways in which Japanese ceramics have come to the fore in modern ceramic art consciousness. So I think he, as far as I know, he didn't write a lot about Teabowls, and Teabowls were not, the majority of his artistic production at any point. What was significant to me was learning that he used the Teabowl as a gift, as perhaps a way of bringing to a smaller scale this encapsulation of his fascination for all things Japan and his, as I said, abstract sculptural pursuits. He he spent some time in Japan, not during World War II, but the point I was trying to make earlier about his experiences during World War II was that I think undoubtedly when we're tracing the history of American ceramic artists working in the 1950s and 60s, artists who had served in the military during World War II, and then in many cases attended universities to pursue art, thanks to the GI Bill, we must account for their experiences of trauma. And I didn't want to make too much of the notion of primitivism. As you know, I looked at the notion of primitivism in relation to the popularity of Hamada Shoji and Kitaoji Rosanjin in the 1950s. And I hypothesized in an article that was published in the journal Design and Culture that the wartime rhetoric of primitivism as applied by the American military towards Japan transformed into an appreciation for the quote primitive unquote in Japanese ceramics in the immediate years after World War II. So that's a kind of sidebar to your question. Thank you.
Maybe Meghen, that slots into a similar question by Sol Jung, who says, I was wondering if any of the American potters you mentioned engaged with Chanoyu, either as a practitioner or a guest at tea gatherings. So did they actually embrace that larger social environment of the tea bowl, or was it just an aesthetic focus on the objects themselves?
That's a really great question. We know that Chanoyu as a practice came to the United States well before the 1950s, when there was some famous public gatherings led by Urasenke to bring the world into friendship and harmony through tea. And undoubtedly, the potters that traveled to Japan experienced Chanoyu, undoubtedly. Whether they had a bamboo whisk and were preparing matcha in their tea bowls is another story. And if Alfred in the 1950s was anything like it is today, there, how should I put it? We're in a part of the world that's far from urban centers. And so any sort of teaching of Chanoyu probably would have had to occurred for these makers based at Alfred by traveling a little bit of a distance. So certainly in Japan, I think the potters that I mentioned who spent time in Japan would have experienced Chanoyu. But that's such an important question, because I think we can say writ large, the tea bowl in terms of its use is disarticulated in the context of North American ceramic art, according to many, many makers. Paul Soldner, who I didn't mention today because he doesn't have a direct relation to Alfred, famously was criticized by the then head of the Raku family for making Raku ceramics, and Soldner's response to this kind of thing was with humor. And so there are catalogs of Soldner's tea bowls that will have captions that say tea bowl parentheses peanut bowl. So I think many potters, and again, I think our ceramic art faculty colleagues will speak to this, saw the tea bowl idiom as a concept from which to launch into creative flight, as it were.
So I think we should probably move into the discussion period. And so Morgan is back with us. And maybe I can open it with a question from Hal Higginbotham, who says, this has been both enlightening and helpful, but do we omit Leach and Hamada so entirely, especially in light of their influence through Warren and others on American potters? And I think that question could be broadened too, to pull Morgan into this, to think about the shaping of a history, the shaping of the trajectory of the Teabowl. So whichever of you would like to start speaking to how these histories are made. Great.
Can I take a stab at one aspect of it? I didn't talk about this today. I think we did hear a little bit about this yesterday, but this very vibrant period of the 16th and early 17th century in Japan in terms of creativity in ceramics in Japan and the emergence of these now iconic Teabowl forms, I think is a really interesting lesson in the idea of cross-cultural influence and the value of borrowing, what today we might call appropriation, because a lot of the new Teabowl forms that emerged in this age were unsuccessful attempts to reproduce Chinese forms. And, you know, we now believe that many of the Setomino Teabowls were really aimed at the jianware, the black and brown iron glazed wares from Fujian and other parts of southern China that Japanese tea practitioners called temmoku, right? And we know that a lot of the ceramic traditions of Western and Southern Japan were either were either led by potters who were brought or trafficked from Korea after the Imjin War, or were influenced by the styles of Korea and by the work of those Korean potters. So a lot of what's generative and new and exciting in Japanese ceramics in the Tokugawa period, especially I think in the world of Teabowls, is based on partial understanding and failed experiments and a lack of proper materials, right? They didn't have saggers, right? They didn't, I mean, there were so many things they didn't know how to do. And that led to something beautiful. And so I tend to think about the work of British and American potters who were bridges in many ways between Japan and the English-speaking world and other parts of the West, in terms of spreading certain ideas and certain forms and certain concepts from Japanese culture throughout the community of ceramic practitioners as being flawed and imperfect. I mean, I don't think that Bernard Leach had the most in-depth understanding of the ceramic traditions that he was making his name as a representative of, to be honest. His understanding of Raku, to be sure, was very ill-formed. But that doesn't mean it wasn't, I mean, we know how influential he was and his students were. And I also don't think it compromises in any way the aesthetic vision, the creativity, the power of the works that they and their students made. So we live in a culture that is a little bit over obsessed with authenticity and originality and perfection of transmission. I mean, Paul Soldner's work in Raku could not be more different from the Raku ceramic tradition in the context of tea in Japan. And he rolled with it. He was playful about it, as exactly as Meghen said. And I think that is entirely to his credit. He acted like the you know, potter that he was, and the American that he was. And so these traditions have evolved as they've moved globally. And I think one of the enemies of the good is trying to be purely authentic when it comes to borrowing and being influenced by ceramic traditions in other parts of the world.
I will add that indeed, Leach was critically important to the way in which many potters in North America understood the Teabowl. We have a page from the Potter's book on display in our Path of the Teabowl. exhibition. And we also outline how Warren Gilbertson's article on Raku was probably widely read by men, including Hal Reiger, who began to formulate Raku Teabowls quite early on and then had a leading role as a teacher. So Leach and Hamada and others were important in this history. My presentation was focused on Alfred, and Leach came to Alfred famously in the spring of 1950. I don't know if he talked about Teabowls specifically with students at that time. Hamada, to my knowledge, never came to Alfred, but many men and women who would go on to become leaders in the field of ceramic art in the second half of the 20th century encountered Hamada famously across this whirlwind tour of the United States in 1952 with Yanagi Soetsu, Bernard Leach, and Hamada. We do have a Hamada Teabowl in the exhibition on loan from the collection of Marlin and Ginger Miller. And it's quite beautiful. It has his frequently used dark brown to black iron-rich glazed with records of his fingers tracing a pattern over the surface. And so yes, there are many historical figures that were involved in this complex network of interlocutors between Japan and the US and also the rest of the world.
So maybe we could turn back to the materiality of the objects a little bit. And I think both of you can speak to this. Nancy Hamilton has asked, I really enjoyed this perspective on Teabowls, particularly the point about Teabowls being disarticulated from use. This speaks to the broader question of whether Teabowls disassociated from use or not practical for use can still be considered Teabowls per se. I would love to hear more of your thoughts on this. So a kind of conceptual question.
Yeah, and it depends on who's answering the question. There's a continuum of opinions from the very orthodox. A Teabowl is only a Teabowl if it's used for tea, right? And then the more the other end of the spectrum is those who view the Teabowl as in part a concept. And this is a theme that's explored in the recently published book by Bonnie Kemsky, The Teabowl East and West. Yes, I've met collectors who've said, you know, you really can't call a Teabowl something that wasn't made for tea, and that's great. There are opinions like that. I respect those opinions, but there are also a significant number of contemporary artists who are, you know, in various ways, shapes, or forms, riffing on or paying homage to or appropriating in some way the Teabowl form. And yeah, we could talk about cultural appropriation if you wish to, but yeah, I think there's a continuum of ways to define the Teabowl according to use. Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking to Japan, a place that, you know, is so tradition bound in the world of ceramics, although that also opens up a space for some artists to push back against tradition in really interesting ways. To answer this question is quite interesting. And I've talked about this before. Some of you may have even heard me talk about this recently, but if you look at Raku Kichizaemon the 15th, the, you know, recently retired head of the Raku family, I mean, for much of his career, he actually maintained two separate workshops. One in which he made his, what he considered his sort of avant-garde artworks, which were Teabowls that were drastically altered and did not adhere to traditional shapes and had glazing effects, fire-in effects so extreme that every tea practitioner I've ever been with, when we saw them in an exhibition, said, "Oh, I don't think I could drink tea out of that." And then he also made, and these are far less celebrated and less well known, but he regularly every year made ceramics for the tea schools, for the wealthy patrons in the tea schools who had always bought ceramics from the Raku family, who were the lifeblood of his family tradition and without whom his family would not exist. And they were much more conventional and adhered to traditional shapes and had much softer glazing. To me, I think both of those styles are Teabowls, but even he had to segregate them because of the different types of collectors, exactly as Meghen said. That differential is obviously amplified in cultures that don't have the tradition of the tea ceremony, shaping the needs of buyers of tea bowls. So we are much more open to what was the word you used? Disarticulated tea bowls, perhaps, in America, where most people are not, practicing a formal thick tea ceremony every week or whatever. And I think that's great. I think that's part of how the tradition of tea bowl production has changed as it's traveled around the world.
And for successful ceramic artists in contemporary East Asia, I don't think this is an uncommon phenomenon. For example, when I was a researcher learning how to make some Korean techniques, this was way back when, at the studios of Shinseong-ho, north of Seoul, I witnessed another example of this, a large-scale studio expressly for sculptural production, and then another whole space dedicated towards the creation of wares with more historical utilitarian roots. So, Hope, should we go back to some of the questions that were really interesting for Morgan earlier, if you want? Or
I answered some of them in the Q&A function, but there's one left from Andy Watsky, and there may be others.
Yes. Andrew's question is, could you talk about the elevation of Chojiro into reified first-generation Raku potter? When did that begin, and how did the mythology around him evolve over time?
Great. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important question. Thank you, Professor Watsky. It happened gradually, and it happened as part of larger social and cultural changes in Japanese society in the 17th century. There was among urban commoners, so artisans and merchants living in cities like Kyoto, a process of what we might think of almost as simultaneous increase in business and gentrification over the course of the 17th century, where the peaceful rule of the Tokugawa, the growing wealth of the residents of cities, and their need to express themselves and to create identity through various cultural practices meant more and more people were studying tea, were buying tea bowls, and also engaging in a whole range of other, cultural practices. And the competition among workshops grew increasingly fierce. Lots of new ceramic traditions emerged around the outskirts of Kyoto and in the provinces over the course of the 17th century. And I think that the competition heated up for the Raku family. There actually were two rival Raku films, the Ohi kiln and the Tamamizu kiln, both of which had a legitimate connection to the original Raku line. So much as the Sen tea schools really tried to emphasize their lineal descent from Sen no Rikyu, to compete for students who would pay for lessons in tea and become members of the tea school, the Raku kiln emphasized Chojiro as the founder, as a celebration of him and his vision, but also as a kind of branding exercise. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be just a cynical kind of, I don't know, economics-based reading of the elevation of Chojiro, nor does it have to be only about the spiritual influence of the founder of the tradition. I think it can be both. And you see this in many, many arts. The late 17th century is a period when, I write about this in Handmade Culture, where there was an increased emphasis on the household as the unit of identity for all Japanese people under Tokugawa rule. And so people started to imagine their family histories and write them down in genealogies with great enthusiasm around the 1670s to 1680s. And that's precisely when the first genealogy of the Raku family is written. Chojiro is identified as the first generation. And after that, you start having publications that celebrate this lineage founded by this man Chojiro, who was an associate of Rikyu, whose name is also being elevated. So there's this kind of circularity of mutual legitimation that happens in the late 17th century in many arts and industries. Thank you for that question.
I have a rather rudimentary question myself. I've never participated in a tea ceremony and I don't know much about the history of it. In Japan, historically, with tea houses, and someone wants to, like, would a tea house specify, put their shingle out saying, we have Raku ware? Or do you know, was it a choice that people made as consumers of tea and participants in a social ritual that they would go to a place that specialized in a pottery, a type of tea bowl that they preferred?
Yeah.
I mean, I have no idea how the mechanics of that consumership occurred.
So in the cities of 17th century Japan, urban commoners often had a mixed studio and residence. So this runs the gamut from clog makers to merchants who sell sake to potters. It was not uncommon for the studio to be on the lower level, the residence on the upper level, and then you have a little shop front facing the street. And the Raku family was known as a chawanya, a seller of tea bowls, and they would have sold their own tea bowls. I'm not aware of shops that sold Raku tea bowls outside of their own storefront in Kyoto, although people in Edo and Osaka and other cities must have been able to buy Raku ceramics. So I don't know the mechanism for how they did that. Possibly they did it through the tea school, through the Iamoto system. Also, the Raku potters sometimes traveled to other places and made ceramics or sold ceramics there in person. Now, a tea house is the literal space in which a tea ceremony is held and didn't usually have a commercial function. So we have to distinguish between a tea house for Chanoyu and what came to be known as tea houses in the red light districts, the licensed districts of cities where courtesans would entertain customers. That's more like a geisha house, basically. Those are very different kinds of tea houses that unfortunately have the same name in English, but are quite different in the Japanese context.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Meghen, there are a couple of questions that maybe speak to some curatorial decisions that you made. One is from David Kwok, who says, can you explain the reasonings why you put the Yatsushiro ware tea bowl and a Goryeo Celadon bowl next to each other? We have discussed this in length, but I would like to know about the initial ideas behind that decision.
Thank you. I'll respond to that in the context of thinking about the tea bowl at Alfred and the sort of points we were seeking to make in this exhibition concept. So indeed, as I've remarked to a number of people over the course of this project, typically in a major museum structure, we would encounter bowls according to their national origins, right? We would go into the Japanese galleries, then we would go into the Korean galleries, and so on and so forth. And this relates to Morgan because we talked about something to avoid in the juxtaposition of the new with the old and so forth in this exhibition. I didn't want to at all imply a sense of contemporary American potters, particularly, to be making works that were somehow, superior because of their conceptual focus, rather than, these 1,000-year-old bowls made by potters whose names we don't know, and so on and so forth. What's remarkable are the moments of intersection, the moments where everything connects. And this actually relates to the question Andrew Maskey posed in the chat about training and learning in colleges and universities. What happened in the United States was remarkably similar to what happened in Japan on some level, in terms of the emergence of ceramic art as a focus of study in the immediate post-war period. Tomimoto Kenkichi establishes the first standalone department for ceramics according to his vision of ceramics as a form of modern art. And this is just when at schools like Alfred, the artistry, the creative potential for individualistic expression through the medium of ceramics comes to the fore. So there are a surprising number of moments of continuity. And what David has mentioned, David is a BFA student at Alfred. What he has mentioned to me is the surprise at seeing these newer works next to older works. And the case he's talking about is Yatsushiro ware, which was made in Japan and is called Mishima in Japanese. Its technique versus the Goryeo dynasty inlaid bowls from many centuries earlier. So there's many complex subpaths along this path of the Teabowl that involve style and concept and relationships. And so I'm glad that it all came together thanks to the support of all of our generous museum and collector lenders.
Maybe there's a related question, and I'm not sure if you've already answered this, Meghen, just say so, from Lauren Deutsch, who asks, I'm wondering how the objects displayed are labeled, especially those made in Korea, but used in the course of chanoyu. Are they called maksabai or maksabal, or another Korean term, or chawan, which is Japanese that describes the appropriated utility of the object? I do feel that using the latter contributes to cultural appropriation and reframes the trajectory of a piece of material culture.
Right. So I think I responded to that in the Q&A text. I don't know if everybody could see that.
I don't think we can see it.
All of the historical bowls from Korea that are presented in the exhibition are not labeled tea bowls because we have no historical evidence that they were used for tea. We suspect in the cases where kintsugi was applied to ceramic tea bowls made in Korea, that those works were likely used in the context of chanoyu in Japan at a later date, but there is not exact provenance. And if you're interested in learning more about the Korean tea bowls in the exhibition, I would encourage you to look at the University of Michigan Museum of Art's website and the comprehensive catalog that was recently published according to the input of a team of experts, and I believe funded by the Korea Foundation on those bowls. And so indeed, and this gets back to some points that Bob Maury was making yesterday. We need to take care to not apply Japanese terms to everything. There are transnational iconic components of this history, but they're deeply layered. They're so complex. And we don't want to, of course, get in the habit of labeling everything a chawan. And when I even use the term matcha, I say this is the word commonly used around the world today, but that's not how it was known in all parts of the world.
Thank you, Meghen. We have 2 minutes left, and there's just one question left. It's a follow-up by Lewis Johnson about the Platinum Teabowl. And he says, I thought that a sense of the long history of the Teabowl and the complex involvement of the body and sensory experience is a part of it. In your view, would it make sense to try to link its discontinuous, almost broken surfaces to damage to recent history of conflicts, such as you mentioned in your talk, and its effects on tradition?
Lewis, thank you for that question. That's really, really interesting. Perhaps I recommend reading an article recently published in the Journal of Modern Craft by David Stent. The title of it, I just pulled it up after I saw you write that, Lewis, is Blue Slipped Stone Burst, Seeing Destructive Plasticity in Takuro Kuwata. And that was again published recently in the Journal of Modern Craft. So there's a lot of interesting work that's been, I think, done and will hopefully continue to be done on the more conceptual and historically contextual elements of works by Kuwata and other artists. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So I believe we're turning it over to the panel or the, sorry, roundtable discussion. So I will sign off and thank you everybody again for a really stimulating conference so far. So exciting. Thank you, Meghen.
Thank you, Hope, for being moderator of that session. And I'm passing the baton over to my colleague, Professor Linda Sikora of the Ceramic Art Division of the School of Art and Design at Alfred University. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Meghen. Mari, you can put a slide up. I think there's a slide there. I'll start as Mari puts that first slide up. So welcome. Thanks. Thank you on behalf of the Division of Ceramic Art to everyone who made the Path of the Teabowl project possible, which was many people, and to Meghen Jones for her invitation to add a brief endnote to the conference by way of this roundtable. So I will be joined by 4 of my colleagues from the Division of Ceramic Art at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University, and we'll speak in alphabetical order based on our surnames, and each speaker will introduce themselves and take the floor for up to, great, 4 to 5 minutes. And just go ahead and advance it, please, Mari. Next. Great. There's the group for you. And they'll offer their reflection on matters of the Teabowl as brought to light by the exhibition, Path of the Teabowl, and also our experience as artists and educators. And then following that, we'll have 10 or so minutes for comments and questions. So if you could, as before, just enter them into the chat or the Q&A. And we'll start first with John Gill. So you could advance to the next slide.
This has been really exciting when Meghen first came here and she thought about what could be done with a Teabowl and kind of just open things up. When I was at Kansas City, I had Ken Ferguson as my teacher. And this would have been a really simple demo that he would have had that would be just something really pretty easy to use. And it was, when you try to open something up, you just try to figure out where your hands go and you just want to make this really simple gesture. Before that, everything would have been based on basically a Turner cylinder that would have been a really simple throwing thing, something. But the Teabowl basically allowed you to have some really quick hand gesture to kind of like move around and kind of make something really work really well with that. When we put together a catalog years ago, it was a 5x7 catalog, and there was a really beautiful, we got this really great Teabowl from Kenny Price that has this really great drip on it. And that thing there just kind of like was such a great thing because he got it from a person who was in the concentration camps, the Japanese internment camps. So that was sort of and he had to figure out how to kind of move it together. I grew up in Seattle, next to the Seattle Art Museum, and they had some really great pots, and I had some really great teachers who kind of would share things. I think that probably Rhodes would have been somebody who was really important as a teacher for bringing Japan to Alfred, but I think that Harder would have been somebody who I would have looked into a little bit earlier with his influence on maybe a Temaku Teabowl. And he worked with a person by the name of Sutton here. And I remember stories of Norm Schulman where there would be different potters showing up to Alfred, who would be, there was one guy who was from Japan who came there through really great Teabowls, but Norm's not here anymore. And then when Rosanjin came, who was a friend of Rhodes, and that was such a great time. He just kept him absolutely drunk for all the time that he was there. And when he left, he liked Genesee ale, and he basically sent us some really great pots. Then as a graduate student, what was really great was the Colonel Fox collection was something that I would always look at. And it would be up in the hallways of Binns Merrill. And that would have been a group of pots that was broken up with Syracuse and Alfred. And Colonel Fox, I think, was sort of a Army Corps of Engineer person who went through and in digging the roads basically found what he needed and then took it home and shared it with Syracuse and Alfred. But, you know, that's sort of an interesting story probably. But as a student, we got to look at that and it was really kind of great. Japan, China, those would be all the stuff that I would have had with Ken Ferguson. Ken Ferguson would have been a big influence on me. Knowing Paul Solner and the Raku story of it, what I like about that is my best description about Paul Solner and Raku is something that you act upon. And it was, how do you just kind of like really act upon it? And the action of the Raku kiln is so important that you take it right out of the hot fire and kind of make something happen with it. So those are just some of the things that I would be thinking about. And it's there's all kinds of technical things that are really kind of, then the lady who was on this morning from Korea and talking about the Koyo Celadon, Bill Carty and Hyojin were working on the Korean Celadons. They're on stoneware. We think it has a really thin glaze. We know exactly how many hours it was fired to. And I honestly think it was fired inside of saggers that were glazed saggers that were the tiles from the Korean roofs. So those would be just something.
Yeah,
That's some of the
great.
stuff.
That's great, John. It's great to end it on those technical conversations we end up having at the JET. Okay, so thank you.
I'm done.
We're going to pass it on, but we're coming back in Q&A, so hold your thought there. We're going to pass it on now to Wayne Higby.
Can you arrange for not this image to be, I don't know, there you go, there I am. Oh, well, this whole process of the conference has been extraordinary. And so many of my questions that I had, involving this idea of the path of the Teabowl have kind of come up and been massaged in one way or the other. I had so many thoughts about the origins of the tea ceremony and how it was embedded in Taoism and in Buddhism. And this notion that it was the tea that was the way, that came up earlier today. And fascinating for me as a young artist, when I was an undergraduate, I was exposed to a Raku demo. And I was told to make a Teabowl, but I didn't know what a Teabowl was. And it was described to me as, well, they fire best in Raku because they have to be put in the kiln, heated very quickly and taken out of the kiln and cooled very quickly. And a bowl shape that is fairly small, fits in your hands, will heat up evenly and it will hold heat when you take it out of the kiln. It cools rapidly. And I said, okay, I'll just make one of those. But it was never told to me about, well, what is a Teabowl? Which is the fundamental question that Meghen asked, in this whole piece that she's curated and how she opened that as a kind of question for the exhibition. So my fascination began then, and I learned about Taoism, I learned about Buddhism, and I became very, very interested in them. And the idea of Buddhism associated with the tea ceremony and the notion of using a common object as a kind of threshold for a meditative device. In other words, you hold this common object, you have the tea, and you begin to enter a zone of speculation and realization. There's breathing attached to that. And this question of emptiness, which is a Buddhist idea, that the world is kind of an illusion and there's something more important behind this idea. And the common object was a philosophical idea that I found very compelling, just intellectually. So today I was thinking, oh, if I was going to create a tea ceremony around this kind of idea of the common object, I would just go to Walmart and get a mug and break the handle off of it and bring it in and use it along with maybe other utensils from Walmart, some common utensils, maybe from Target, that were common objects and within the vernacular of our current sort of life and living. And to use these common objects as a kind of threshold in which to cross into a sort of awareness of this illusion of what surrounds us, so to speak. So that's a deeper kind of investigation of the Buddhist side of this idea, but I became fascinated by that as a young artist. And then very interested in how this idea of the Teabowl influenced making art in other genres. So I got very interested in Robert Irwin's Garden at the Getty and how he talked about holding a Teabowl and an evening dinner with a collector and how he began to think about how that would influence his garden. And so that led me to think of all the possibilities of art making and certainly ceramics making that would be in one way associated with the Teabowl or the idea of the Teabowl or that centrifugal force that surrounds that vortex associated with Taoism and Buddhism and the idea of the Teabowl and the tea ceremony in essence. So I think of all of that, the possibilities of what works of art have been influenced by that and works of ceramic art, which rather than make it too autobiographical, the bowls that I make, that I made for a long time and I became quite well known for, were in not a really a far-fetched way in my head associated with some of that learning that I mentioned about the way and about this Buddhist idea of the common object, and some things associated then with the tea ceremony. I became very interested then in artists and how they have influenced the tea ceremony and how they've influenced the path of the Teabowl, and very interested in cultural icon and how Japan has branded a kind of cultural phenomenon around this. And also very interested in the marketplace, of course, where there is so much monetary and financial construct around the Teabowl and the marketing of the Teabowl and the idea of the artist and the individual artist in the Teabowl, all of these things that are just so fascinating. And so that really led me when I first was asked to take this position as director of the Ceramic Art Museum at Alfred. It really led me to start talking with Meghen. And it led to this idea that back in I think it was 2015 when I first said, well, how about we do a show called Path of the Teabowl? And it's been fascinating, absolutely brilliantly fascinating, a wonderful exercise for me in the learning curve that at this stage in my life as a professional ceramicist and artist, I've been able to really engage more deeply, thanks to Meghen, thanks to her curatorialship, and thanks to this wonderful conference that has been brought to us by so much collaboration, of course, behind the scenes, all the folks that make things work around here, and the staff at the museum, and everyone who's put this together with Meghen leading us into this adventure. It's been
That's-
quite an extraordinary experience. So there's just a
great.
slight touch on some of the things that have driven my thought patterns, and be fun just to continue the conversation, probably in, you know, forever. It will go
I
on.
forget, yeah, beyond the Q&A. Thanks so much, Wayne. That's great. We're going to move now to Walter, I believe is up next here. So Walter, if you want this screen off, just Mari can
Well,
do that.
just
for you.
keep that up. Hi, everyone. Just keep that up for 1 second.
Yeah, let me see the work for me.
Yeah, I am. I'm here at this conference, and I'm learning more about Teabowls than I think I've ever known in my life, because I've not been on the path of the Teabowl per se as a sculptor, but brushing up against it in a number of different places. And I just want to tell you a bit of a story. And I guess you can take that image down of my sculptural work at the moment. But and I think that Meghen Jones covered a lot of this story, but I had the good fortune of coming to ceramics through throwing pottery. And my undergraduate professor at the University of Connecticut for 4 years was Minnie Nagoro, who you saw in that wonderful black and white photo with Daniel Rhodes. Of course, Minnie was, as I was an undergraduate, was very tight-lipped about her own history. So I really didn't discover this story until from Susan Peterson, who told it to me once. And then I'm learning more in Sequoia Miller's essay in O Pioneers. What's the name of that? Oh, Pioneers, Women Potters from 1925 to 1960 or so. But Minnie Nagoro is in there. But when I studied with Minnie, she, you know, you could see that in her work, that there was this kind of Mingei influence still in her work. And you could see that she, one piece that she, of her heritage, I suppose, that she always maintained was this kind of interest in spontaneous brushwork. But that was as close as we, as students, ever got to her, you know, her heritage. The Teabowl never came up, and nor did really any deep discussions about her Japanese roots. We were mostly exposed to her interests in kind of contemporary design, and my influences happened to be mostly European. The books that were in the studio were on Lucy Ree and Hans Koper and that kind of modernist work. So it was just interesting to me when I learned this story of her being in the Heart Mountain internment camp and studying, then learning pottery from Daniel Rhodes, and who's someone that made Teabowls, and then also meeting Leach, and according to Sequoia Miller, Leach extolled the virtues of Japanese art and Japanese aesthetics to Minnie, and yet when she went through Alfred and got out of Alfred in 1950 and struck out her own to be a production potter. And basically, you can see in her work, left most of her, any of the kind of Japanese heritage behind, and had a more modernist aesthetic. And I learned more of an Alfred methodology from her, because she went through Alfred. So we studied glaze chemistry fairly deeply. And when I got to California, when I lived in California, and then later went to graduate school at Alfred, I started to encounter Teabowls, and you know, I had no relationship to them throughout. I thought when the undergrads at Alfred were throwing them, that it seemed a bit like a default thing to throw. It was like a cup without a handle, you know, not to again, you know, the scholarship I'm learning here is really amazing. I just didn't have much experience with it. So that's my brush with the path of the Teabowl. And thank you for just hearing that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Walter. Samar, you can, yeah, thank you. That's great. Okay, so go ahead and advance. I do have 4 slides here. I'm glad Walter mentioned Mingay, and Mingay came up later in some of the talks today. So that's sort of where I went to when Meghen extended this invitation. So I'll start first by saying that Teabowls are their own context and they carry it with them. So that's maybe my first thought. And as we know through this exhibition project, they travel in more ways than one, and sometimes they travel down paths. And in all this moving about, the context they carry, it can integrate, it can stand apart, it can influence, it can encounter, engage, it can differ, etc. So Teabowl entered my context through the genealogy of my education. I came of age as a ceramist in Canada and Minnesota in the early 1990s. And at that time, my primary graduate advisor was American ceramist Mark Ferris. Ferris was a student of Warren Mackenzie when Warren was, and so when he was a student, Warren was 42, Leach was 80, and Hamada was 74. I was 1 country and 2 generations removed from the American ceramist GI Bill trained World War II veterans who, quote, eagerly studied Japanese ceramics, as wrote Jenny Sorkin in her book, Live Form. I absorbed Teabowl as Eastern, cultured, ritual, spiritual, and quite separately as North American, masculine, performative fetish. I also absorbed Teabowl through the Mingay movement, Mingay as arts of the people. In 2003, I was included in an exhibition at the Mingay International Museum in San Diego titled Mingay Legacy. This is the catalog here, and it was a project by Michelle Conroy. The project celebrated Mingay and also made a little bit of an opening to the complexity of Mingay. Mingay was a movement starting to be addressed through the growing field of post-colonial studies, the matrix of power relations that were at the foundation of Mingay, and the works of scholars who identified the movement as typical of the moral aesthetics and nationalism of industrializing countries such as was Japan at that time. Also wrote how it was not unlike the arts and craft movement of Ruskin and Morris in the UK. Next, please. In this curatorial effort, I was identified as the 4th generation of a lineage branching from Leach of the UK to Mackenzie to Ferris to myself, all of North America. At that time, and I wrote here, I considered Mingay and in concert with the political and the philosophical. I came to think about Mingay as an active phenomena that changes over time and through use, and it has been used to define beauty, to make a case for material culture, to address the human condition. And it's also been used to justify, position, reinforce barriers, and to claim authority. So I did drink from the historical stream, but I tried to keep my eyes open, and I was constantly recomputing my whereabouts. Next. In this same catalog, Richard Wilson writes of Mingay, if the rhetoric was seductive, it also came to be selective and custodial. We learn about Mingay through its appointed representatives, through its canonical texts, and through its sanctioned showplaces. So this is how I came to understand Mingay, and this is also how I learned about and sorted the Teabowl. Next, the phenomena of Mingay and the phenomena of the Western Teabowl became conflated in my mind. If Mingay was selective and custodial in the East, its legacy within contemporary ceramic culture was similar in the West. For me, that manifests in my early and personalized experience of the Western Teabowl by contemporary potters as exclusive and gendered, masculine, performative, and fetish. As we work to understand understanding, however, we always carry our history. My encounter with the ancestry of the Teabowl in general has also been invaluable in the way it escorted me to my personal ancestry of colonial French Canada and Eastern European immigration. Tea and Teabowl also brought me to Song Dynasty black and brown ceramics and tortoiseshell glazes. It brought me to work of women ceramists in Japan, Yanagi's beauty, was another place it brought me, and his writing about how we long for beauty because we long for home and that beauty is our primordial home. Yanagi's thoughts on the power of pattern to open the scope of the imagination was very influential on me. In turn, Yanagi's writing brought me to contemporary writers like Elaine Scarry, who wrote in her book On Beauty about beauty and being wrong, and the way that beauty teaches us about the relationship between fairness and justice. It brought me to, and that brought me to Gertrude Stein, Identity and Entity, the power of the private household space, and Stein's position that there is no repetition, to Eve Sedgwick's wisdom and invigoration of weak theory, to Kathleen Stewart's ordinary affects and atmospheric attunements, and the way things are mattering all of the time. Can Teabowl be taught? I was not taught Teabowl, but I did see it demonstrated. The tea ceremony was explained to me, the Teabowl was put into my hands. Things travel outward and practices travel inward. All this traveling about puts things into the air, and once they're in the air, anything is possible. There can be no reasonable expectation of pinning it all down. Thank you. And so let's advance. Next, please. And here we have Adara Willard.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope so. I am here at Alfred as a visiting professor. I'm on my second year here, and I will be continuing on for one more year. I did get my bachelor's in fine arts here in '95, and I feel like my return to Alfred as a visiting professor has been a really interesting one, from coming from being a student so long ago and then returning to teach students who were my same age at that time, and seeing the questions and struggles. Oh, and you can take that image out if you and anyway, seeing the struggles that I am familiar with, that have like I like to use the word haunting sometimes when I think about my return to Alfred, and how things kind of come back. And so a couple of questions that came up from this really beautiful show at the museum. And that show has been very inspiring in so many ways from a teaching point of view. But why are we making, I had my students do a project around the Teabowls, like go to the museum, sketch their 2 or 3 or 4 of their favorite Teabowls, have Meghen have a guided tour with Meghen. Why are we making these Teabowls? And I think the question, that comes from, what does clay teach us? And so for me, coming to clay was a very physical and physical reaction. I literally had a physical reaction. I know many of us do, actually. I don't think that's uncommon. But that really is how I felt, like my path through and I love these like comments from Walter, brushing up against the path. It's very physical, this idea of movement. But and so I think coming to that from that point of view, I really am tied to this idea that that connection to the Teabowl really is really that connection of the lip, the hand, the material, the kind of the invisibility of the form when the actual ceremony is in process. We are part of a community, we are part of interaction. All of that, I think, is a really beautiful and profound way to teach. Now, the idea of the other question that my students have is about appropriation. And I think that's a really good thing to talk about with students. But I really think that there is this aspect of sharing of ideas that in connection to that conversation about why we are learning something from somewhere is also this internal, very powerful concept that comes from the forms itself. So in thinking about holding this form in your hands and teaching that, a student can kind of start to understand this physical relationship to themselves, and then hopefully therefore find this connection to a cultural connection at large, a global, a larger, a conversation. And I think this show has been really amazing as a teaching mechanism, as a teaching method. I don't know if it's a mechanism, but and this idea of juxtaposition of the old and new, that's also like history and current times and what we're talking about right now with sharing of space and sharing of hands, sharing of breath, sharing of talk. I think all of this is, I'm just amazed that this show is happening right now in the face, and I know I ran out of time, but in the face of this pandemic where we can't touch each other, we can't, sort of can now, but we can't like share this space, that this show is about that. This show is about these forms that are about this communal space. And I just really want to thank everyone. And I'm really honored to be here as a past student and as a current professor to hopefully impart something to my students on my own path in this world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adero. And I might just keep you to start with David Quack's question. It's long, so I can read it out loud too. Question to the roundtable. Do you think the Teabowl can be reintroduced to Alfred Ceramic vernacular? It is such an icon, almost to the point of a religious sense, that it is impossible to navigate the field without having knowledge of their existence. Wouldn't it be in the best interest of the school for the instructor to provide the idea of the Teabowl and its manifestations within our history? It sounds like that's what you're doing. And then witness the ways in which the students individually interpolate the ideas that inspired them the most when creating such objects. Maybe this exercise will be the way in which the next generation will further explore and alter how the many permutations of the Teabowl will manifest within our world in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a long one, so I probably will only touch on part of that. But I think that this is a great, I think the Teabowl is a great lesson project to learn about these very specific relationships to this ceremony, to the community, to this history. I think along that line, I think that this can open up other conversations about form, that we also nuances of forms from other parts of the world that also can aid in these conversations about material community history. So like I was thinking about this Teabowl, sorry, I won't take too long, but Teabowl show, and I was like, well, what other kinds of forms would I really like to see in the museum? And I am personally kind of obsessed or really thinking about these West African coil pots, and I just wonder how those, how each of these forms from different parts of the world could continue, like have a continuum of a conversation in our classrooms, as opposed to this sort of idea of teaching from one point of view about these forms, have it be sort of these things come to us and expanded upon, have all of these like amazingly knowledgeable voices talk to us about these things. So we are really immersed actually in these forms. So that will be all. Sorry.
That's great. Does anyone else want to jump in with David's question? I don't know that I'm seeing another one, although if someone sees one.
Linda?
Go ahead.
This is Wayne. So David and I have talked, and he's a wonderful young man and a very interested and engaged ceramic artist. One of the things that we talked about very early on was this idea of concept. And I think the teaching in the Teabowl exhibition has a lot to do with this. Perhaps if I were back in the studio with undergrads, the idea of concept or idea, and we put a lot of emphasis on idea, and that you have to get an idea before you go off to make anything. But there's an interesting piece there that occurred to me when I was talking to David the first time, which had to do with the concept versus some kind of artistic vision that just is somehow intuitive or somehow present in the moment as you digest and begin to assert the concept. So we talked about, he said, well, when I'm making a Teabowl, I have to slow down and I have to slow the wheel down or however I'm working. And then he says, you know, and then I try to shape it. And I said, so what is it about the shaping? Okay, it's like more volume or more thrust or more height or more width, or at some point, the artistic vision, which may not be located in a kind of intellectual concept, becomes a kind of choice.
Well, you know, I've always said that concept's the other C word, craft being the first one. And concept really, you know, is idea. And idea really is about being moved. It's seeing, you know, about light. I think the word concept has become sort of complexified in art schools because even in our school, I don't think anyone's actually making conceptual art. That doesn't mean that art has ideas. So I think, you know, separating these is productive. And it's interesting when you're thinking about physical engagement of material and coming off this conversation of the Teabowls and the physicality, the bodily sort of experience you have in front of these objects.
What that reminded me of today was the comments of Meghen's around the Volcas and some other members of the audience members touching on that. You know, there was this phenomena of a kind of the iconoclast. This was the MO of early modernism, and certainly the modernism associated with the ceramic revolution, which is always, Volcas is always tagged with, this kind of iconoclastic attitude. So take something as deeply embedded in a kind of intellectual structure as a Teabowl, and then just expand it and break it apart and take it down and be humorous about it and open it up. So you know, the plot here has to do with opening up and sort of questioning all of these kinds of more highly intellectualized structures. So that's where we're back to David's question, I think, about what are the possibilities, you know, from this route, what can happen in your own creative sense, and to be a bit of an iconoclast.
Let's
how you just empower yourself to access your own vision.
That's great. So let's jump to Walter. He's got a comment.
I'd say that I think my colleagues immersed in pottery and functional pottery, I think what happens in the undergraduate population, whether they make a Teabowl or don't make a Teabowl, I think they come to an understanding that, you know, through touch and through functional pottery, it is through a kind of communal ritual, you know, there's a certain kind of connection happening, which is one of the things that I get from listening to the scholars talk about the Teabowl and touch and aspects of holding it and aspects of the tea ceremony where you're having this kind of ritual experience together. I mean, somehow I think our students really, the undergrads really, when they're into the vessel or making pottery, they really tune into that. And, you know, and then often like the Teabowl or a kind of cylindrical vessel is a very nice space to hold a lot of drawing and a lot of information, you know, and it sometimes isn't understood from another kind of position of form. So those are two sort of things that go on, I think. But Linda can tell us better, or Adero.
Well, I'm sort of answering to the boss, Meghen Jones, right now. We're getting close to time, but I think we have a minute left if someone wants to jump in.
We are good. We can go on
We're good?
longer.
A little bit? Okay.
Yeah, because this was meant to be discussion for everybody. So yeah, let's continue.
Maybe we could just welcome some of the other panelists into the window would be nice, or there's not too many questions in the chat. Go ahead, John, is your hand? Oh, no. He was hitting his.
Hi.
his
Oh, I
hide-
wanted-
hide video. Mhm.
I-
There he is.
Hi,
Hi.
how do I untap it?
The mute. Just unmute, John, if you have a question, please. I was wondering, Adero, coming back. Oh, we have someone.
Hi, yeah.
Oh, great. Hi, Morgan.
This is
Yeah,
Morgan
please.
Pitelka.
Hi.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm really interested in what you think about the issue that I raised of, I guess, being authentic or true. Can't beautiful things be made through misunderstandings? I mean, does creativity rely on a kind of accurate scholarly understanding? I mean, I am a historian, so when I'm doing research on the history of Raku ceramics, for me, it really matters that the claims I make are evidence-based in a scientific way. I don't see any reason why that has to be true for a potter. If a potter wants to be inspired by a vision of Chojiro or of Rikyu that is largely a product of the imagination, that seems great if the work is meaningful. So I don't know, I feel like sometimes the role of the truth in creative acts is fuzzy, and I would really appreciate your expert commentary on that.
Morgan, you just put your finger on it. You just put your finger right on it. Can you hear what I'm saying? Yes, absolutely. Creativity is based on how you bridge, a variety of things in your mind. It was explained to me once as kind of a tip of an iceberg or the limbs of a tree, being able to cross-reference as many things as possible is a kind of a touchstone of creativity. So, pure accident, being present, being aware, paying attention, listening to all the scholarship, listening to your brilliance in talking to us about, artists and the path of the Teabowl that you understood. But putting things together, across a variety of fields is a kind of at the heart of the artistic practice. So, we have to be iconoclasts, we have to be open, we have to have fun, we have to be playful, we have to tackle concept, and we have to go deep.
I think
so. It's a big job. It's a lot of fun.
One of my favorite quotes is James Trilling, which I remind students of. There's nothing original about groping around in the dark when you can reach out and turn on the light. So in some way, it's just about turning on the light and not being afraid of that. I think sometimes young makers are worried that they'll be overly influenced, in fact, by things, and they maybe isolate or edit sometimes their moves, perhaps. So encouraging, I think, that kind of really moving towards engaging in all of creative culture as thoroughly as they can is productive.
It looks like Adero is going to say something. I just want to say also.
Oh, you go. Yeah, you go.
No, I mean, this is not to ignore the issue of power. I think borrowing without paying attention to inequities in terms of race and gender and histories of colonial dominance is also a mistake and problematic. So I don't mean to say like art lets everyone off the hook in terms of identity politics. I just meant that there's something slippery about the relationship between the truth and the creative act that at the very least is worth digging deep into, which all of you do in your work, obviously. Sorry, Adele.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah, I think that's been a big conversation. That's at least a lot of my seniors, or a few of them, have been talking to me about that, like an interest. One of my students is interested in, or we were talking about indigo, and then where that, how beautiful that is, and how inspiring, and you can grow it here, you can grow it everywhere, but it does have these cultural kind of roots in places. So, we were talking about truth, like how do you love, cherish, understand this material, whether the Teabowl, indigo, all these other things that we embrace, like kind of work around. Like in my own work, I am kind of grappling with this idea of appropriation, because my own personal identity is so kind of mixed through many, many things. So what is it that I get to work with? What do I? So anyway, I think it's this, one of my students was talking about sort of we were talking about this idea of truth, like really knowing when something is, you're doing something right from a certain place. And that is what we kind of grapple with as artists. It does also have to do with listening. I think we've all been talking about that. And that's something that we've been talking about in our Idea Lab, which is this space where we can talk about cultural diversity. And it's like, it is literally how you understand someone who isn't like you, or who you don't, not sure how to communicate, or whatever it is. If you're not sure you're doing something right, it's listening first, hearing first, taking it in, digesting that content, and then figuring out from some place that you know of a truth, there is work there. But then I do agree, Morgan, I think that's a really great concept of like, there is that place, that creative, playful place that we all do also have. And as professors, we want to encourage that as well. It's that like mix of encouraging the playful, the mistakes that actually become learning. And then also the work, the listening, the history, all of that. So, and I love that quote, Linda, you've said once before, the James Trilling quote. I just have to have that somewhere written on my wall.
When you're speaking, Adero, I'm thinking also about just with students separating research, which they're doing as students. So it's all research with what work they put out in public, right? Those are two ways of being in the studio.
Very
So
true.
I see Meghen is on the screen, which means perhaps we're wrapping, or?
We've got a couple more minutes.
Okay, great.
Sun Young Sang wrote a question. It's 3:46 a.m. in Seoul. I hope you took a little cat nap in there, Dr. Sang. She writes, some historians would say that a historical Edo Teabowl is like a conceptual piece of art, and that its interpretation is really open-ended. What are your takes on this view? We have an Edo style bowl on loan from the University of Michigan Museum of Art in the exhibition in that central case next to another Korean bowl, and then next to a Teabowl by Tsujimura Shiro. So these were bowls produced around the 16th century in Korea. Could we see those as conceptual?
Small c, capital C. I mean, they have ideas in them, right? They are of the culture, so they have concept, and in some way conceptual would be relative to perhaps the time and the intent of the maker and how it interfaced with culture at that time, I guess.
Other thoughts?
What was the end of that question? It had to do with open-ended.
The interpretation of a 500-year-old bowl made in Korea could be open-ended. It could be seen as conceptual art. And in my mind, I go to the notion that the tea ceremony could be seen as performance art.
I think those two things, a good concept, this idea of the concept, now that we're kind of crystallizing it as a terminology. But often, that quality that's embedded in that is the notion of a reveal that's kind of an arrival, which is open-ended. This notion that it leads to many, many other things because it has kind of channeled you into this kind of recognition this kind of aha moment that opens to you greater possibilities in the world, or greater possibilities of understanding, or greater possibilities altogether. I think that's kind of at the heart of the Teabowl and the tea ceremony, in a sense, that whole piece is somewhat of a threshold, the concept, the ritual, the whole structure of it that allows us to contemplate something in depth, which then opens us to the possibilities that lie ahead of that, or lie behind that, or in the future of that.
Darrow, David has a question in the chat that I saw you responded to. I'm just actually sorry, my chat is moving around.
Yeah, I see the question. Yeah, does everyone see the question?
Do you want to read it for us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Or do you think the current environment of Alfred is a place where students can pursue their creativity with freedom, or have we created too many boundaries of identity, power, hierarchy, race to the point that students are actively censoring and editing their work to stay in their creative lane? I didn't know if that was it's a pretty big question, David. I don't know if you are a student here. That's a great question for maybe for another time, but I do think I think there's a yes and a no to that question. It's something that yeah, I think students are grappling with. And do I think I feel like students are still very creative here. And I think I hope we create a place here where those questions don't hinder creativity, but they can still happen. And I feel like that with my colleagues, we in ceramics, I feel like we do that here. And we also, with my colleagues that I'm here, for a short period of time, I feel like we all are questioning these things ourselves with in relation to teaching. So I think this is, an ongoing thing, and I feel positive about Alfred's ability to be really mindful and thoughtful of that question, David. But I think that's a bigger, this is something we can talk about it, and maybe another time.
Darrow, can we take this to the Idea Lab?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
That would be great.
Question.
Okay, good. Let's do that.
Is David a student here?
He was.
Yes.
Is he still? Yes.
You can usually find him at the exhibition.
Okay, I would love to talk with you more, David.
He's been there many times.
Okay. Come find me. Let's talk.
That's great. Great. Good.
Yeah, thank you, David, for your question and for your enthusiasm about the exhibition and this conference. Were there other questions? Lauren Deutsch writes, I agree that the tea ceremony is a performance art in the fullest sense that it is an art form in and of itself and incorporates other art forms. It's completely misunderstood that it's ancient or religious. And yeah, we're reaching the 3 o'clock end point here. Cultural appropriation is a topic I've discussed with many of the students who've come to the museum for tours. And I like to reference the 2 types of appropriation, one written by James Young. He writes, content appropriation occurs when an artist has made significant reuse of an idea first expressed in the work of an artist from another culture. But as we know, appropriation can also involve, as Bruce Ziff and Pratima Rao have written, cultural damage through the flawed rendering of the other. So one of the kind of sparks in the early stages of this project that, as Wayne mentions, started several years back was just this very question of the Teabowl being a global idiom and how the history of the Teabowl relates or doesn't to the vast and problematic history of cultural appropriation. So any further thoughts on that, or on anything from our panel of ceramic art faculty.
Meghen?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's Andrew.
Andrew, okay, I'm going to add you to the spotlight.
Okay. I just might mention that Raku Kichizayama on the 15th, when I talked to him back in the 90s, was very adamant that Raku was his family name and Raku was his family's ceramics, and no one else had the right to call their work Raku. So he felt that anyone who used the term Raku, and I'm not sure how completely serious or intent on this he was, but anyone who was using Raku was basically misappropriating his family name and his family's mode of ceramics. Just to throw that out there.
Right. And I think many of us have heard the story of Paul Soldner meeting the then head of the Raku family in Japan in the 1970s at the World Craft Council conference, I believe it was called. And it was quite an exchange, apparently. And Paul Soldner from then point forward said, okay, I'm going to call what I make ukar.
Yeah.
It's not Raku, it's ukar. So perhaps on that note, we will wrap things up. I'm going to invite Wayne as Director and Chief Curator of the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum to speak for about a minute, just to make any kind of closing remarks you would like to, Wayne.
Oh,
And
well, thank you, Meghen, and thank you,
making this
Meghen.
exhibition
Again
possible.
for organizing all of this. I just wrote something in the chat. It's very simple. I said, wow. And I wrote, wow, yesterday as well. This entire process in regard to the engagement with ideas and history has been remarkable. Thank you, everyone. And when I say everyone, it's all of the scholars and the presenters, but fascinating material, absolutely fascinating material. And all of those behind the scenes that make it possible for us to do this. Doing the Zoom, doing all of this organizational piece to make it run smoothly. And I think it has run very smoothly. Those folks, that's part of the everyone that really need to be congratulated and thanked for allowing this to take place. It's been so special. And, I think of that collaboration that also includes the audience, all of the members from all parts of the world who have joined us and really been participants in this, allowing us to, actually engage in this fashion, because of course, without the audience, you're talking to yourselves pretty much. And that sometimes isn't the whole answer to what we're trying to accomplish with this whole conference. So thank you to the audience, and thank you to everyone. It's been a remarkable opportunity for the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum. And hopefully you all will become members of the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum and send us your ideas for exhibitions and see what we can, parlay all of this into in the future. Thanks again, Meghen.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you so much. I'm going to make a couple remarks as we conclude our day and a half of stimulating, thought-provoking sessions. Bear with me a moment. Here we are. We've reached the end of this path for now of the Path of the Teabowl Conference. Thank you to the amazing array of curators, scholars, and Alfred Ceramic Art faculty who've taught us so much over the last day and a half. Thank you to the audience for your engagement. You posed outstanding questions on all things Teabowl, techniques, social histories, Chanoyu, museum display, pedagogy, and more. Thank you so much to Mari Hammond, Bill Geis, Caitlin Brown, for producing this event behind the scenes. Please, everyone, come to Alfred to see our exhibition on view through December 29th. An exhibition catalog is also forthcoming. As we know all too well, it continues to be a challenging time in this world. I'd like to conclude our time together today with this calligraphic inscription. And we might imagine we're in a virtual tea room together, looking at it on the wall. It reads Sennen no Midori, or Green of 1,000 Years. It's by Toda Jitsuzan, head priest of Daiji-in, a sub-temple of Daitokuji in Kyoto, and it's featured in the Path of the Teabowl exhibition on loan from the University of Michigan Museum of Art. Sennen no Midori is a popular Zen idiom referring to the green of a pine tree that has withstood 1,000 years. The evergreen of the pine tree symbolizes strength in the face of adversity. Be well, everyone. Goodbye. Take care. We'll continue our meeting if you wish to stay on for a bit more and chat, to say hello with the recording off. But with this, I end the conference. Thank you all.